Hi, I'm Rachel Torres, and 3 months ago, I discovered my father-in-law had been secretly canceling my gym membership behind my back. His reason? To save the family money. What he didn't realize was that he'd just triggered a chain of events that would expose 20 years of financial manipulation, destroy his carefully crafted reputation, and ultimately land him exactly where he deserved to be. The irony? He always said I wasn't smart enough to understand family business. Turns out I understood it better than he ever imagined. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The notification popped up on my phone screen just as I was grabbing my water bottle from the kitchen counter, already running late for my morning CrossFit class. Payment declined. Your membership at Desert Peak has been suspended due to non-payment. Please contact our billing department to resolve this issue. I stared at the message, confusion washing over me like cold water. My membership was set to autopay from our joint checking account every month. I'd been going to this gym for 3 years, religiously showing up at 5:30 every morning before work. It was my sanctuary, the one place where the stress of deadlines and family drama melted away under the weight of barbells and the rhythm of my breathing. I called David while rushing to get dressed for work instead of the gym. He picked up on the second ring, his voice groggy from sleep. "Babe, did you see anything weird with our bank account?" My gym membership got declined. There was a pause, a long one. The kind that makes your stomach drop before your brain catches up. "Oh, that. Yeah, Dad mentioned he was going to handle some of our monthly expenses. Streamline things," he said. "Make sure we're not wasting money on unnecessary stuff." Unnecessary stuff. The words hit me like a physical blow. 3 years of 6 a.m. wake-ups, 3 years of building strength, both physical and mental, 3 years of a routine that kept me grounded through his father's constant criticism, and his mother's passive-aggressive comments about my career choices. Unnecessary. "David, you let your father cancel my gym membership without asking me?" "It's not like that, Rach. He's just trying to help us save money. We can find a cheaper gym, or you could jog around the neighborhood. Same result, right?" Same result. As if the community I'd built at Desert Peak, the trainers who knew my goals, the group of women who'd become my closest friends, could all be replaced by running circles around suburban sidewalks. I hung up and stood in our bedroom, still in my workout clothes, feeling utterly displaced. The morning light streaming through our curtains suddenly felt harsh instead of hopeful. This wasn't about $59 a month. This was about Gerald Whitman's need to control every aspect of our lives, and my husband's complete inability to see it. The drive to Southwest Marketing Solutions felt longer than usual. I kept thinking about the conversation, replaying David's casual dismissal of something that mattered so deeply to me. When had he stopped seeing me as a partner in our marriage and started viewing me as another line item in his father's budget spreadsheet? My coworker Carmen noticed my mood the moment I walked into our shared office space. Carmen Rodriguez had been my closest friend since I'd started at the marketing firm 2 years ago. She was one of those people who could read your energy from across the room, probably because she'd survived her own family drama and recognized the signs. "What's wrong? You look like someone stole your favorite coffee mug and then ran over your dog." I slumped into my desk chair and gave her the abbreviated version. Her expression grew darker with each detail. "Wait, hold up. Gerald canceled your gym membership? Without asking you. And David thinks this is normal behavior? Apparently it's called helping us save money." Carmen's eyebrows shot up toward her hairline. "Girl, that's not helping. That's financial abuse disguised as generosity. How long has he been pulling stuff like this?" The question caught me off guard because I'd never really thought about it as a pattern before. But once Carmen planted the seed, memories started flooding back. Gerald suggesting we didn't need cable television because we could watch shows at his house. Gerald recommending we cancel our meal kit subscription because his wife could teach me to cook proper family meals. Gerald advising David to switch our car insurance to a company that gave him a referral bonus. Each time it was framed as helpful advice. Family looking out for family. Gerald's expertise in real estate and investments made him the natural person to guide our financial decisions. Except somewhere along the way, his guidance had become control, and his suggestions had become demands. It's been gradual, I admitted to Carmen. Little things here and there. But Rachel, my gym membership? That was mine. I earned the money that paid for it. I was the one who woke up every morning to use it. He had no right. Did David know it mattered to you? Of course he knew. He used to complain about how early I got up for classes. He knew I loved it there. Carmen leaned back in her chair, studying my face with the intensity of someone working through a complex problem. This isn't about the gym, Rachel. This is about boundaries. And from what you've told me about Gerald over the years, boundaries aren't exactly his strong suit. She was right, and I'd been too close to the situation to see it clearly. Gerald Whitman operated under the assumption that family meant access. Access to our decisions, our finances, our time, our privacy. When David and I got married 4 years ago, I thought I was gaining a father figure. Instead, I'd inherited a dictator who smiled during Sunday dinners while systematically dismantling my autonomy. The rest of the workday dragged by in a haze of client calls and campaign revisions. I kept checking my phone, hoping David would text with some kind of explanation or apology. Instead, I got a message from Gerald himself. Rachel, I've transferred the cost of your gym membership to your savings account. Consider it an early birthday gift. We can discuss more productive uses for those funds at Sunday dinner. The audacity was breathtaking. He'd canceled something important to me without permission, then repositioned it as a generous gift. The money was supposed to make me grateful instead of angry. It was manipulation masquerading as kindness, wrapped up in the language of family care. I showed the text to Carmen during our afternoon coffee break. Oh, hell no. This man is playing mind games with you, and he's doing it so smoothly that he probably doesn't even think you'll notice. What do you mean? Look at the language. He transferred the money as a gift, but he's already planning to discuss how you should spend it. He's taking away your choice while making it seem like he's giving you options. It's psychological manipulation, Rachel. The kind that makes you question whether you have a right to be upset. Carmen's words crystallized something that had been bothering me for months. Whenever I expressed frustration with Gerald's involvement in our decisions, David would remind me how lucky we were to have family support. When I mentioned feeling suffocated by the constant advice and suggestions, David would point out how much money Gerald had saved us over the years. I was being gaslit into gratitude for my own oppression. That evening, David came home with takeout from my favorite Thai restaurant and a bouquet of flowers from the grocery store. Peace offerings. He'd clearly spent the day thinking about our morning conversation and decided the solution was romance rather than conversation. I thought we could talk, he said, setting the food on our dining table. I know you're upset about the gym thing. The gym thing. I repeated his words slowly, tasting the dismissal in them. David, your father made a unilateral decision about my life. He canceled something that belonged to me, without my knowledge or consent. And you're calling it a thing. He looked genuinely confused by my reaction, but he gave you the money back, plus extra for your birthday. I don't understand why you're still mad. This was the moment I realized how deep the problem ran. David couldn't see the violation because he'd been raised in a household where Gerald's word was law. Individual preferences and boundaries were foreign concepts in the Whitman family structure. Everyone fell in line. Everyone accepted guidance. Everyone was grateful for Gerald's wisdom. Everyone except me. It's not about the money, David. It's about respect. It's about the fact that your father thinks he has the right to make decisions about my life, and you think that's normal. He's trying to help us build a stable financial foundation. That's what family does. No, that's what controllers do. Family respects boundaries. Family asks before making decisions that affect other people. Family doesn't manipulate you into feeling grateful for having your choices taken away. David's face shifted, and I could see Gerald's influence in the way his jaw tightened.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
You're being dramatic, Rachel. It's a gym membership, not a constitutional right. There it was. The same minimization I'd been hearing for years, whenever I questioned Gerald's methods. My feelings were always too big, my reactions always too intense. My boundaries always too rigid. I was being dramatic for wanting basic respect in my own marriage. "I'm going to bed early," I said, leaving the untouched Thai food on the table. "I need to think." That night I lay awake, staring at the ceiling while David slept soundly beside me. I thought about all the small concessions I'd made over the years. The vacation destinations chosen by Gerald because he knew the best resorts. The financial advisor recommended by Gerald because family should stick together. The birthday celebrations hosted at Gerald's house because he had more space and resources. Each decision had been reasonable on its own. Taken together, they painted a picture of a life that wasn't really mine anymore. Somewhere in the process of becoming a Whitman, I'd stopped being Rachel Torres. But the gym membership felt different. It was the first time Gerald had actively taken something away from me rather than simply steering me toward his preferred option. It was a line crossed, a boundary violated so clearly that even David's practiced rationalizations couldn't disguise it. I thought about Carmen's words about financial abuse and control. I thought about the pattern of gradual erosion that had brought me to this point. Most of all, I thought about the version of myself who used to wake up at 5:30 every morning, energized by the promise of physical challenge and personal growth. That woman wouldn't have tolerated this. That woman would have fought back. The next morning, I called Desert Peak and reactivated my membership using my personal credit card. I told them to flag the account with a note that only I was authorized to make changes, regardless of who called or what family relationship they claimed. It was a small act of rebellion, but it felt like planting a flag on territory that belonged to me. When I got to the gym, my trainer Marcus noticed I'd been missing. "Everything okay, Rachel? Haven't seen you in a few days." I gave him the short version about the billing issue, keeping the family drama to a minimum. But Marcus, who'd been working with CrossFit members for over a decade, had seen this kind of thing before. Happens more often than you'd think. Usually it's controlling partners. But sometimes it's family members who think they know what's best for everyone else. The thing is, fitness isn't just about physical health. It's about mental strength, community, personal achievement. When someone tries to take that away from you, they're not saving you money. They're undermining your foundation. His words hit me harder than any workout had. Gerald wasn't just managing our finances. He was systematically weakening the things that made me feel strong, confident, and independent. The gym was just the latest target in a campaign I'd been too close to recognize. That afternoon, I started keeping a list. Every suggestion, every decision, every financial recommendation Gerald had made since David and I got married. The pattern was undeniable once I laid it all out on paper. Year 1. Suggestions about cheaper alternatives to things I enjoyed. Year 2. Recommendations for service providers who are connected to Gerald's network. Year 3. Direct involvement in our major purchases and financial planning. Year 4. Unilateral decisions made on our behalf, presented as gifts or family support. It was a masterclass in gradual control, executed so skillfully that the victim barely noticed until the cage was fully constructed around them. But cages, I was learning, were only as strong as the person inside them believed they were. And I was starting to remember exactly how strong I used to be. The Wednesday morning CrossFit class was particularly intense. Box jumps, burpees, and a climbing ladder of deadlifts that left my muscles screaming and my lungs burning. But as I finished the workout, sweat dripping onto the rubber mats, I felt more like myself than I had in months. Carmen met me for coffee after work that evening, and I showed her the list I'd been compiling. "Girl, this is not normal family behavior. This is a systematic takeover of your adult life." She studied the timeline with the focus of someone analyzing a marketing campaign. "Look at the progression." He started with money-saving suggestions that seemed helpful, then moved to recommendations that benefited his network, then graduated to making decisions for you. And every time you went along with it, he got bolder. So what do I do? First, you document everything. Keep records of every financial decision he's made for you and David. Second, you start making independent choices and see how he reacts. And third, you figure out what David's role is in all this. Is he a willing participant or just a trained SEAL? Carmen's plan made sense, but it also felt dangerous. Going against Gerald Whitman wasn't like standing up to a regular controlling family member. Gerald had money, influence, and a network of people who owed him favors. He also had something more powerful than any of those resources: my husband's unquestioning loyalty. But as I drove home that evening, I realized I had something Gerald couldn't control or take away from me. I had the truth. And increasingly, I was learning that the truth had a power all its own. The confrontation I'd been dreading came sooner than expected. Sunday dinner at the Whitman estate was a weekly tradition that had felt less like family bonding and more like performance evaluation ever since I'd joined the family. This particular Sunday, Gerald had prepared what he clearly thought would be a triumphant presentation. "Rachel, I'm glad you're here. I wanted to discuss some exciting developments in your financial planning." He pulled out a folder thick with paperwork and spread it across the dining room table like he was unveiling architectural plans. Investment portfolios, savings account statements, and projected budget worksheets covered in his precise handwriting. "I've been analyzing your spending patterns, and I think we can optimize quite a bit more, starting with that new gym membership you signed up for. I know you were attached to the old place, but I've found a municipal recreation center that offers similar services for $15 a month. The facilities are older, but the fundamentals are the same." I looked around the table. David was nodding along like Gerald was delivering a lecture on quantum physics. Patricia, David's sister, was studying her plate with the focused attention of someone trying not to get involved. David's mother, Helen, was smiling in that brittle way that suggested she'd learned long ago not to question Gerald's presentations. This was the moment. I could nod along, accept the municipal gym recommendation, and continue the slow fade of my identity into Gerald's grand design. Or I could plant my flag and defend the territory that belonged to me. "I'm not switching gyms, Gerald." The words hung in the air like smoke from a fired gun. Gerald's pen stopped moving across his notepad. David's fork paused halfway to his mouth. Even Patricia looked up from her careful examination of the pot roast. "I'm sorry, what did you say?" "I said I'm not switching gyms. I reactivated my membership at Desert Peak, and I'm keeping it. The facilities, the community, the trainers, they're all important to me. $15 versus $59 isn't worth giving up something that contributes to my physical and mental health." Gerald's smile tightened around the edges, but his voice remained calm. "Rachel, I understand you have emotional attachments to certain routines, but we're talking about building long-term financial stability. Small sacrifices now lead to significant benefits later. It's not a sacrifice I'm willing to make." The silence that followed felt like standing in the eye of a hurricane. Gerald set down his pen with deliberate precision and folded his hands on the table. "I see. And David, you're comfortable with your wife prioritizing her personal preferences over your family's financial goals?" There it was, the trap, perfectly laid. Gerald wasn't just questioning my decision. He was questioning David's authority as a husband and his loyalty as a son. I could see the conflict playing out across my husband's face as he tried to navigate between supporting his wife and disappointing his father. "Maybe we could compromise," David said weakly. "Try the municipal center for a few months and see how it goes?" "There's nothing to compromise about," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. "This is my decision to make, with my money, about my health and happiness. Gerald, I appreciate your financial advice, but you don't get to make unilateral decisions about my life." Gerald's mask slipped just slightly, and for a brief moment I saw something cold and calculating in his eyes. Then the smile returned, warmer and more condescending than before. "Of course, dear. I would never want to overstep. I just hope you'll keep an open mind as we continue working together on your financial future." But I heard the threat underneath his gracious words. This wasn't over. If anything, it was just beginning. As we drove home that evening, David was quiet until we pulled into our driveway. "Did you really have to embarrass him like that in front of the whole family?" "I wasn't trying to embarrass anyone. I was standing up for myself. He's trying to help us, Rachel. He's saved us thousands of dollars over the years." "At what cost, David? When did we stop being adults who make our own decisions and become children who need Daddy's permission for everything?" David turned off the engine and sat in the darkness of our garage for a moment before responding. He's not trying to control us. He's trying to secure our future. There's a difference. Is there? Because from where I'm sitting, it looks like he's systematically eliminated every choice that doesn't fit his vision of what our life should look like. David got out of the car without responding, but I could see that my words had landed. Maybe not with the impact I'd hoped for, but somewhere in the part of him that used to make independent decisions before Gerald's influence became all-encompassing. That night, I started a journal. Not just a list of Gerald's financial manipulations, but a record of my own thoughts and feelings as I began to reclaim pieces of myself I'd given away without realizing it. The gym membership was just the beginning. The journal entries started innocently enough. Simple observations about conversations, decisions, and the subtle ways Gerald inserted himself into our daily routines. But as I filled page after page over the following weeks, a disturbing portrait began to emerge. Entry after entry revealed the same pattern. Gerald would identify something in our lives that brought me joy or independence, then systematically work to eliminate or control it. My book club became too expensive when he suggested we could just share books from his personal library. My photography hobby was deemed impractical when he recommended I focus on skills that could generate income. My Friday night dinners with college friends were labeled as wasteful spending when he pointed out how much money we could save by entertaining at home. Each suggestion had seemed reasonable in isolation. Gerald presented himself as a mentor, sharing wisdom accumulated through decades of successful business dealings and financial planning. He never demanded compliance, never raised his voice, never issued ultimatums. Instead, he created an atmosphere where disagreeing with his advice felt ungrateful, immature, and financially irresponsible. The brilliance of his manipulation lay in its subtlety. Gerald understood that direct control breeds rebellion, but gradual influence breeds dependency. By positioning himself as the family's financial expert and wise patriarch, he'd made questioning his judgment feel like questioning the family structure itself. 3 weeks after the Sunday dinner confrontation, I was reviewing client campaigns at work when Carmen dropped into the chair across from my desk with the intensity of someone bearing important news. "I've been thinking about your Gerald situation, and I did some research on financial abuse patterns. Rachel, what he's doing has a name. It's called economic coercion, and it's more common than you'd think." She handed me a printout from a domestic violence resource website. The behaviors listed under economic abuse read like a checklist of Gerald's greatest hits: controlling how money is spent, preventing someone from making independent financial decisions, using financial resources as a tool to maintain power and control in relationships, gradually isolating someone from their support systems through financial manipulation. This is family involvement, not domestic violence. I protested, but even as I said the words, they felt hollow. Economic abuse doesn't only happen between romantic partners, Carmen explained. Parents, in-laws, and other family members can absolutely be perpetrators. The goal is the same: maintain control by limiting someone's financial autonomy and independence. I stared at the printout, feeling something fundamental shift in my understanding of the past 4 years. Gerald wasn't helping us build financial stability. He was systematically creating financial dependence. Every dollar he saved us came with strings attached. Every piece of advice came with expectations. Every generous gesture came with increased obligations to defer to his judgment. But what about David? He genuinely believes his father is helping us. Carmen leaned back in her chair, studying my face with the careful attention of someone choosing her words deliberately. That's the thing about generational patterns, Rachel. If David grew up in a household where Gerald controlled all the financial decisions, then financial autonomy probably feels foreign and scary to him. His father's control doesn't feel oppressive, it feels safe. The accuracy of her observation hit me like physical impact. David had never lived independently as an adult. He'd moved from his parents' house to a college dorm room they paid for, then to a graduate school apartment they subsidized, then directly into our shared life, where Gerald continued managing major financial decisions. David had never experienced the anxiety of choosing his own insurance provider, the satisfaction of saving for something he wanted, or the confidence that comes from successfully managing independent finances. Gerald had raised a son who was fundamentally unprepared for financial independence. then positioned himself as the permanent solution to problems he'd created. That evening, I decided to test Carmen's theory. Over dinner, I casually mentioned that I was thinking about opening my own retirement account instead of contributing to the family investment portfolio Gerald managed for us. David's reaction was immediate and telling. His face went pale and he set down his fork like I'd suggested we burn down the house. Why would you want to do that? Dad's portfolio has consistently outperformed the market. He's got connections and expertise that we'd never have access to on our own. I'd like to learn about investing for myself, make some independent decisions about my retirement planning. But you don't know anything about financial markets? You could lose everything. There it was. The fear that Gerald had cultivated so carefully in his son. David genuinely believed that financial independence was equivalent to financial ruin. In his mind, Gerald's involvement wasn't control. It was protection from the inevitable disasters that would befall us if we tried to manage money on our own. David, I have a master's degree in business marketing. I understand risk assessment, market analysis, and strategic planning. I'm not incapable of learning about retirement investments. It's not about capability, it's about experience. Dad's been doing this for 30 years. And how will I ever gain experience if I never make independent decisions? David looked genuinely confused by the question, as if the concept of gaining financial experience through practice was foreign to him. In Gerald's system, financial knowledge was something you inherited from the family patriarch, not something you developed through personal trial and error. The conversation ended with David promising to talk to his father about involving me more in investment decisions, still positioning Gerald as the ultimate authority, just with slightly expanded input from his daughter-in-law. It was progress, but in the wrong direction. The next morning, I opened my own investment account online. It was a small act of rebellion, just like reactivating my gym membership, but it represented something larger. I was starting to build parallel systems that existed outside Gerald's sphere of influence. The psychological impact was immediate. Making independent financial decisions, even small ones, reminded me what autonomy felt like. Choosing my own investment strategy, researching fund options, and setting up automatic contributions gave me a sense of agency I'd forgotten I could experience. 2 weeks later, David mentioned casually that his father wanted to review our monthly spending patterns to optimize our budget for the upcoming year. He's noticed some irregular expenses on our joint account and wants to help us identify areas where we might be wasting money. Irregular expenses. I knew immediately what Gerald had discovered. My renewed gym membership, my individual retirement contributions, and a few other small purchases I'd made independently were showing up as anomalies in his careful monitoring of our financial activity. David, does it concern you that your father monitors our spending closely enough to notice individual transactions? He's not monitoring, he's helping. There's a difference. But there wasn't a difference, and I was tired of pretending otherwise. Gerald had access to our joint checking account because David had added him as an authorized user in case of emergencies. Those emergencies had gradually expanded to include routine bill payments, budget optimization, and now spending analysis. Gerald wasn't just offering financial advice, he was conducting financial surveillance. The confrontation came during our next mandatory Sunday dinner. Gerald had prepared another presentation, this one focused on what he termed expense irregularities that needed to be addressed for optimal financial health. He spread our bank statements across the dining room table like evidence in a criminal trial. Highlighted transactions glowed yellow under the chandelier light. My gym membership. My retirement contributions. A book I'd ordered online. Coffee purchases from the shop near my office. Parking fees from a weekend downtown with friends. These expenses represent a concerning pattern of impulsive spending that undermines our carefully constructed financial plan, Gerald announced to the assembled family. Rachel, I know change can be difficult, but financial discipline requires sacrifice from everyone. The public nature of his criticism was deliberate. By involving the entire family in what should have been a private conversation between spouses, Gerald was applying social pressure and positioning himself as the reasonable authority figure addressing a problem created by my irresponsible behavior. I looked around the table at faces that reflected various degrees of discomfort. Patricia was staring at her hands. Helen was nodding along with her husband's presentation like a supportive board member. David was studying the bank statements with the concentrated focus of someone trying to see what his father saw. These aren't impulsive expenses, Gerald. They're deliberate choices about how I want to spend money I earn. Personal preferences must be balanced against family financial goals. Individual desires can't supersede collective responsibility. What collective responsibility? These are my personal expenses, paid for with my individual income, for things that affect only my own life. Gerald's smile tightened, and I could see him recalculating his approach in real time. Public shaming hadn't worked, so he shifted to paternal disappointment. Rachel, I'm not trying to control your choices. I'm trying to help you understand the long-term consequences of those choices. Every dollar spent on immediate gratification is a dollar that can't be invested in your future security. And who decided that gym memberships and retirement planning qualify as immediate gratification? The question caught him off guard because it exposed the arbitrariness of his categories. Expenses that increased my independence were labeled as wasteful, while expenses that increased my dependence on family support were considered wise investments. Perhaps we should discuss this privately, Gerald suggested, but I could see that my public resistance was making him uncomfortable. His authority worked best in one-on-one conversations where social pressure and family dynamics could be leveraged more effectively. I think this conversation is finished, I replied. My spending doesn't require family approval or committee review. The silence that followed was different from the stunned quiet after my gym membership declaration. This silence felt dangerous, loaded with the potential for consequences I couldn't yet predict. Gerald folded the bank statements with precise movements and returned them to his folder. When he looked up, his expression was pleasant again, but something cold flickered behind his eyes. Of course, dear. I appreciate your perspective, and I respect your independence. I just hope you'll keep an open mind about financial collaboration as we continue building towards shared family goals. But his tone suggested that my independence was a temporary inconvenience. He was confident he could overcome. The drive home was tense. David waited until we were in our garage with the door closed before expressing his frustration. Why do you keep fighting him? He's trying to help us build wealth and security. Most people would be grateful to have that kind of family support. Most people wouldn't tolerate having their personal expenses reviewed and criticized by their in-laws. It's not criticism. It's guidance. David, your father just spread our private bank statements across the dinner table and lectured me about coffee purchases in front of your entire family. How is that not invasive and inappropriate? David turned off the car and sat in the darkness for a moment. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a weariness that made me realize how exhausting this conflict had become for him too. He's not trying to hurt you, Rachel. He's trying to protect our future. Maybe his methods aren't perfect, but his intentions are good. Good intentions don't excuse controlling behavior. And what if he's right? What if we're making financial mistakes that we're too inexperienced to recognize? What if his guidance is the difference between security and struggle in 30 years? There it was. The fear that Gerald had so carefully cultivated. David wasn't defending his father's methods because he thought they were appropriate. He was defending them because he was terrified of what might happen without them. Gerald had convinced his son that financial independence was financial suicide, that questioning paternal guidance was equivalent to choosing poverty, that autonomy was just another word for reckless endangerment of the family's future security. David, what did your financial life look like before you met me? The question seemed to confuse him. What do you mean? I mean, what financial decisions did you make independently? What investments did you choose? What budgets did you create? What financial goals did you set without your father's input? He was quiet for a long time, and I could see him mentally reviewing his adult life, looking for examples of independent financial decision-making. I never really needed to make those kinds of decisions. Dad was always there to help with the big stuff, and the day-to-day expenses were pretty straightforward. So you've never actually managed money without Gerald's involvement. I've managed money. I just had good advice while I was doing it. But even as he said the words, I could see doubt creeping into his expression. For the first time, David was beginning to question whether Gerald's involvement had been helpful guidance or systematic prevention of natural adult development. That night, I made a decision that would change the trajectory of everything that followed. I started documenting not just Gerald's financial manipulations, but also his methods of psychological control. Every conversation, every suggestion, every instance of social pressure or emotional manipulation went into a detailed record that I kept in a locked file on my personal laptop. If Gerald wanted to treat our relationship like a business transaction, I would treat his behavior like a case study in family financial abuse. And unlike his subtle long-term manipulation, my documentation would be precise, comprehensive, and legally admissible if necessary. The war for my financial independence had officially begun, but Gerald didn't know I was fighting back yet. He still thought he was dealing with a temporarily rebellious daughter-in-law who would eventually see reason and fall back into line. He was about to discover how wrong he was. The first sign that my quiet rebellion was having an impact came 3 weeks later when Patricia called me directly instead of going through David. Patricia had always been the Switzerland of family conflicts, neutral, diplomatic, and carefully non-committal about anything that might create waves. "Rachel, can we meet for coffee? I wanted to talk to you about something, and I'd prefer to do it away from the house." We met at Copper Moon Cafe on a Thursday afternoon. Patricia looked nervous, fidgeting with her wedding ring and glancing around like she was worried about being overheard. "I've been thinking about what happened at Sunday dinner a few weeks ago," she began carefully. "The whole bank statement review thing. What about it?" It reminded me of something that happened to me right after I got married. Robert and I had been planning a weekend trip to Sedona. Nothing fancy, just a chance to get away and spend some time together. We'd saved the money, booked the hotel, arranged time off work. Everything was set. Patricia paused to sip her latte, and I could see her gathering courage to continue. The day before we were supposed to leave, Dad called Robert with some urgent investment opportunity that required immediate attention. Family meeting, financial discussions, paperwork that needed to be reviewed and signed. The timing was coincidental, Dad said. These opportunities don't wait for convenient scheduling. "Did you go on the trip?" "We postponed it." The investment opportunity was time-sensitive, and Dad convinced Robert that missing it would cost us thousands in potential returns. We never rescheduled the trip. Something always came up when we tried to plan it again. Patricia's story sounded familiar. Gerald's impeccable timing in creating financial emergencies that interfered with activities that didn't serve his interests seemed to be a pattern rather than coincidence. "That was 8 years ago," Patricia continued. "Robert and I still haven't taken that trip to Sedona. Every time we plan something independent, Dad finds a reason why the timing is wrong, or the money would be better spent elsewhere. Have you talked to Robert about this?" Patricia laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Robert thinks Dad saved us from making a financial mistake by prioritizing immediate pleasures over long-term investments. He's grateful for the guidance." I could see the exhaustion in Patricia's eyes, the weariness of someone who had spent years having her desires reframed as financial irresponsibility and her independence redefined as selfishness. "Why are you telling me this?" "Because when I watched you stand up to him at dinner, I remembered what it felt like to want something for myself. I remembered what it felt like before I learned to check with Dad before making any decisions that cost more than $20. Patricia's confession opened a floodgate of similar stories. Gerald's systematic control extended far beyond my marriage with David. He had been orchestrating the financial lives of his adult children for decades, positioning himself as the indispensable source of wisdom and stability while gradually eroding their capacity for independent decision-making. "Patricia, do you have your own bank account, savings that Robert doesn't know about, any money that Dad can't track or access?" She looked at me like I'd suggested she start dealing drugs. "Why would I need secret money? Robert and I share everything, and Dad helps us optimize our joint finances. Having separate accounts would just complicate the investment strategies. What if you wanted to buy something that Robert and Gerald didn't think was a good financial decision? Then I'd probably reconsider whether I really needed it." they usually have good reasons for their concerns. Patricia's response revealed the depth of Gerald's psychological programming. He had convinced his daughter that financial independence was unnecessary, that individual desires were probably misguided, and that questioning family financial authority was equivalent to questioning family love and loyalty. What if their reasons aren't as good as you think? What if they're just different priorities? Patricia was quiet for a long time, staring into her coffee cup, like it might contain answers to questions she'd never been allowed to ask. "I used to paint," she finally said. "Watercolors, oils, acrylics. I was pretty good at it. I even sold a few pieces at local art shows during college." "What happened to your painting?" Dad explained that art supplies were expensive, and the financial return on creative hobbies was essentially zero. He suggested I channel my creative energy into home decorating projects that would add value to our property instead of consuming resources for purely personal satisfaction. "Do you miss painting?" "I used to." But Dad was right about the financial aspect. Art supplies are expensive, and I wasn't making enough money from sales to justify the investment. Patricia's story was my own story with different details. Gerald had identified something that brought his daughter joy and independence, then systematically eliminated it by reframing creative expression as financial waste and personal fulfillment as family disloyalty. What if the point wasn't to make money? What if the point was just to paint because you loved it? Patricia looked at me like I'd spoken in a foreign language. The concept of spending money on something purely because it brought joy, without considering return on investment, family benefit, or Gerald's approval, was so foreign to her that she couldn't even process it as a valid option. As I drove home from coffee with Patricia, I realized that Gerald's control extended far beyond individual financial decisions. He had created a family culture where personal desires were automatically suspect, where individual autonomy was redefined as selfishness, and where questioning his judgment was equivalent to rejecting family bonds. But more importantly, I realized that I wasn't the only person trapped in Gerald's system. Patricia, David, and probably Helen too, had all sacrificed pieces of themselves to maintain family harmony and financial security. They had all learned to suppress individual desires that conflicted with Gerald's vision of optimal family function. The difference was that they had been raised in Gerald's system from childhood. They didn't remember what autonomy felt like because they had never experienced it as adults. I had joined the family as a fully formed person with my own identity, preferences, and capacity for independent decision-making. Gerald's methods worked best on people who had never known anything different. He was discovering that they worked less well on someone who remembered what freedom felt like and was determined to get it back. That evening, I made another entry in my growing documentation file. But this time, I wasn't just recording Gerald's behavior. I was developing a strategy to expose the full scope of his control and help his family understand what they had been conditioned to accept as normal. The gym membership had been just the beginning. Now I was preparing for something much larger, a complete dismantling of the psychological and financial systems Gerald had spent decades constructing. He still thought he was managing a temporary rebellion from a difficult daughter-in-law. He had no idea that I was building a case that would ultimately free his entire family from the prison he had so carefully constructed around their financial lives. The real fight was about to begin. Gerald's response to my growing independence was swift and calculated. Instead of direct confrontation, he deployed what I would later recognize as a masterclass in strategic manipulation disguised as family concern. The first salvo came through Helen, delivered with the sweet poison that only mothers-in-law can perfect. She called me on a Tuesday afternoon while I was reviewing campaign metrics at work, her voice dripping with maternal worry. "Rachel, dear, Gerald and I have been talking, and we're concerned about some changes we've noticed in your behavior lately. You seem stressed, defensive, maybe even a little paranoid about family finances. We're wondering if you might benefit from talking to someone professional about managing anxiety." The audacity was breathtaking. Gerald had pathologized my resistance to his control, reframing my boundary setting as mental health symptoms that required therapeutic intervention. By routing the suggestion through Helen, he positioned himself as the concerned father-in-law rather than the controlling manipulator, while simultaneously recruiting another family member to validate his assessment of my psychological state. I appreciate your concern, Helen, but I'm not anxious or paranoid. I'm simply making independent financial decisions like any adult. Of course, sweetheart, but sometimes when we're under stress, we can't see patterns that are obvious to people who love us. Gerald has so much experience with family financial planning, and he's only trying to help you avoid mistakes that could hurt your future with David. There it was again, the familiar refrain that positioned Gerald's control as protection and my resistance as self-destructive behavior that threatened my marriage. Helen had been recruited as an unwitting accomplice in Gerald's campaign to gaslight me back into compliance. Has Gerald asked you to have this conversation with me? No one asked me to do anything. I'm calling because I care about you, and I can see that family stress is affecting your happiness. Dr. Morrison has helped several women in our social circle work through similar adjustment issues with family financial planning. Dr. Morrison. Gerald had already identified a therapist who specialized in adjustment issues with family financial planning. The efficiency of his manipulation was almost impressive in its thoroughness. He had pathologized my resistance, recruited Helen as his messenger, and identified a professional solution that would likely reinforce his narrative about my need for guidance and support. I'll consider it. I lied, ending the call before Helen could schedule an appointment for me. But Gerald's psychological offensive was just beginning. That weekend, David came home from his regular Saturday morning tennis game, with his father carrying a stack of financial planning books and a concerned expression. Dad suggested these might be helpful for you. He thought if you understood investment principles better, you'd feel more comfortable with the family financial strategies. The books were dense academic texts on portfolio management, market analysis, and retirement planning. Gerald had chosen reading material that was deliberately overwhelming and technical, designed to make me feel inadequate and reinforce his position as the family's indispensable financial expert. David, I don't need Gerald's reading assignments. If I want to learn about investing, I can choose my own educational resources. He's not assigning anything. He's just trying to help you feel more confident about financial decisions. You said you wanted to be more involved in planning, so he found resources that could help you contribute more meaningfully to family discussions. The manipulation was multi-layered. Gerald had positioned educational support as the solution to my resistance, while simultaneously suggesting that my current level of knowledge was insufficient for meaningful participation in financial planning. The books weren't resources. They were props in a performance designed to highlight my amateur status compared to his professional expertise. I flipped through one of the books, noting the complex charts and statistical analyses that would require significant time and background knowledge to understand. Gerald wasn't trying to educate me. He was trying to overwhelm me with information that would make his simplified guidance seem preferable to independent learning. What if I'd rather learn through hands-on experience with my own investments instead of theoretical study? Dad thinks that's pretty risky without a solid foundation in financial principles. He's seen too many people lose money by jumping into investing without proper preparation. Of course he had. Gerald's anecdotal evidence always supported his preferred narrative, and his preferred narrative always positioned him as the safe alternative to dangerous independence. That evening, I received a text from Patricia asking if I wanted to join her for a spa day the following weekend. The invitation seemed innocent until I noticed that the spa she'd chosen was the same resort where Gerald's business partner owned a wellness center. Patricia's text included details about a financial wellness seminar that happened to be running during our visit. Gerald was orchestrating encounters designed to reinforce his messaging while maintaining plausible deniability about his involvement. The spa day would give Patricia an opportunity to share concerns about my recent behavior, while the financial wellness seminar would provide professional validation for Gerald's approach to family money management. I declined the spa invitation and instead spent Saturday morning at CrossFit, where the physical exertion helped clear my head and the supportive community reminded me what healthy relationships looked like. Marcus, my trainer, noticed that I seemed particularly focused during our workout. "You're channeling some serious energy today. Everything okay?" I gave him the abbreviated version of my family financial drama, keeping the details general but sharing enough to get an outside perspective. "Sounds like someone's trying to make you doubt your own judgment," Marcus said as we cleaned equipment after class. "I see it sometimes with members who have controlling partners or family members." They start second-guessing basic decisions about their own health and fitness, because someone else has convinced them they can't be trusted to make good choices. His observation crystallized something I'd been feeling but couldn't articulate. Gerald wasn't just controlling our finances. He was systematically undermining my confidence in my own judgment. Every suggestion, every piece of advice, every educational resource came with the implicit message that my independent thinking was inadequate and potentially dangerous. The thing is, Marcus continued, physical fitness and financial fitness aren't that different. Both require consistent habits, informed decision-making, and the confidence to stick with strategies even when progress feels slow. If someone's trying to convince you that you can't handle one, they're probably trying to convince you that you can't handle the other either. Marcus's parallel between physical and financial independence resonated deeply. Gerald had never criticized my professional competence or my ability to manage complex marketing campaigns, but he had consistently questioned my capacity for personal financial management. The distinction wasn't accidental. Professional success that benefited the family was encouraged, while personal autonomy that threatened family control was undermined. Monday morning brought a new escalation in Gerald's campaign. David forwarded me an email that Gerald had sent to both of us, outlining what he called a family financial harmony plan, designed to address recent tensions and ensure optimal resource allocation for everyone's benefit. The plan was presented as a collaborative framework, but reading between the lines revealed its true purpose: formalizing Gerald's control while creating the appearance of democratic family decision-making. The document proposed monthly family financial meetings where major purchases would be discussed and approved by committee. Individual spending above certain thresholds would require family consultation. Investment decisions would be made collectively, with Gerald serving as the primary advisor and Helen providing emotional wisdom to balance analytical thinking. Most insidiously, the plan included a conflict resolution process for family members who struggled with collaborative financial decision-making. The process involved counseling with Dr. Morrison to address quote 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 Decisnell and institutionalized his authority. Any resistance to family financial control would be treated as a personal psychological problem, requiring therapeutic intervention. The plan made compliance appear rational and resistance appear dysfunctional. "What do you think?" David asked after I'd finished reading. "It seems like a fair way to involve everyone in decision-making while still benefiting from Dad's experience." "David, this isn't collaborative decision-making. This is a formal system for Gerald to control our financial choices while making it seem like we have input. How is asking for family input controlling? He's trying to create transparency and include everyone in the process, because the process is designed to reach predetermined conclusions. Gerald isn't asking for our input so he can be influenced by it. He's asking for our input so he can address our concerns and guide us toward his preferred outcomes." David studied the document again, and I could see him trying to identify the manipulation I was describing. But Gerald had crafted the language so carefully that his control appeared as guidance, his manipulation looked like collaboration, and his psychological pressure felt like family support. "I think you're reading too much into this. Dad's just trying to prevent the kind of conflicts we've been having lately. The conflicts we've been having are because I want basic autonomy over my own financial decisions. Gerald's plan doesn't resolve that conflict. It institutionalizes his authority to override my autonomy whenever he disagrees with my choices." But David couldn't see the trap because he'd never lived outside of it. Gerald's system felt normal to him because it was the only system he'd ever known. The idea that adults should make independent financial decisions without family oversight was foreign and frightening to someone who had never experienced that level of personal responsibility. That afternoon, I received a call from Dr. Morrison's office asking if I'd like to schedule a consultation to discuss family financial stress management. Helen had apparently provided my contact information and mentioned that I might benefit from professional guidance during a difficult adjustment period. The receptionist was friendly and professional, clearly unaware that she was participating in Gerald's manipulation campaign. Dr. Morrison specialized in family systems therapy with a focus on financial conflict resolution. Her approach emphasized collaborative decision-making, healthy communication patterns, and individual responsibility within family structures. Under normal circumstances, Dr. Morrison's services might have been genuinely helpful, but in Gerald's hands, therapy became another tool for reinforcing his narrative that my resistance was a personal problem, rather than a reasonable response to systematic control. I declined the consultation, but the call served its purpose. Gerald had demonstrated that he could mobilize professional resources to pathologize my behavior, and that he had family support for his assessment of my psychological state. The message was clear: conform to family financial expectations, or face increasingly professional intervention designed to modify my attitude. The pressure campaign intensified throughout the following weeks. Helen started dropping by our house unannounced with baked goods and concerned observations about my stress levels. Patricia began sending me articles about the benefits of collaborative financial planning and the dangers of financial independence for married couples. David's conversations increasingly focused on his worry about my happiness and his confusion about why I was making family relationships more difficult than they needed to be. Gerald had activated his entire network to reinforce his messaging, while maintaining his position as the reasonable patriarch who only wanted what was best for everyone. Each family member delivered pieces of his narrative without necessarily understanding their role in a coordinated psychological pressure campaign. The brilliance of his approach was that it made me appear to be the problem. I was the one creating conflict, the one resistant to family harmony, the one making financial decisions that worried people who loved me. Gerald had positioned himself as the solution to problems that my behavior was causing, rather than the cause of problems that my behavior was addressing. But Gerald made one crucial miscalculation. He assumed that isolation and pressure would eventually wear down my resistance and force me back into compliance with family financial expectations. He didn't anticipate that his escalating manipulation would provide me with increasingly clear evidence of the systematic nature of his control. Every conversation, every suggestion, every concerned family member, every professional referral became additional documentation in my growing file. Gerald's campaign to gaslight me into submission was actually providing me with comprehensive proof of his manipulation tactics and their impact on family dynamics. The most damaging piece of evidence came from an unexpected source. David left his laptop open one evening while he went to walk the dog, and I noticed an email thread between him and Gerald titled Rachel Situation Management. The email chain revealed months of coordination between father and son to address what Gerald characterized as my increasing financial irrationality and resistance to family guidance. Gerald had provided David with talking points for conversations with me, strategies for redirecting my attention when I raised concerns about family financial control, and suggestions for monitoring my independent financial activities. David wasn't just a passive victim of Gerald's manipulation. He was an active collaborator in a campaign designed to undermine my autonomy and gaslight me into submission. The husband I thought was conflicted between supporting me and pleasing his father was actually following his father's explicit instructions for managing my resistance to family financial control. The email thread included Gerald's analysis of my psychological motivations, his assessment of which family members could be most effective in influencing my behavior, and his timeline for resolving what he called the Rachel problem through strategic intervention. I screenshot every email in the thread and added them to my documentation file. Gerald's own words provided irrefutable evidence that his concern for family financial harmony was actually a calculated campaign to eliminate my independence and restore his unquestioned authority over our financial decisions. But more than evidence, the emails provided clarity about the true nature of my marriage. David hadn't been torn between competing loyalties. He had chosen his father's authority over his wife's autonomy from the beginning. Every conversation where he appeared to consider my perspective had been scripted by Gerald. Every moment where he seemed to understand my concerns had been followed by Gerald-coached responses designed to redirect my thinking. I was married to someone who viewed me as a problem to be managed, rather than a partner to be respected. That night, I made a decision that would change the trajectory of everything that followed. I stopped trying to convince David that his father's behavior was inappropriate. I stopped hoping that family members would recognize Gerald's manipulation and support my independence. I stopped believing that Gerald might eventually respect boundaries if I just explained my position clearly enough. Instead, I began planning a comprehensive response that would expose Gerald's control to people outside his sphere of influence and demonstrate the full scope of his manipulation to anyone who cared to see the evidence. Gerald wanted to play psychological chess with me. He was about to discover that I'd been studying his moves for months, documenting his strategies in exhaustive detail, and preparing a response that would checkmate his entire system of family control. The manipulation phase was over. The reckoning was about to begin. Carmen was the first person I called when I was ready to move from documentation to action. We met for coffee on a Thursday evening, and I brought my laptop with the comprehensive file I'd been building for months. I need to show you something, and then I need your help figuring out what to do with it. I walked Carmen through the evidence systematically: Gerald's financial surveillance and control, Helen's recruitment as a messenger for psychological manipulation, Patricia's confession about decades of sacrificed independence, David's collaboration in a campaign to gaslight me into submission, Dr. Morrison's office being contacted without my knowledge or consent. Carmen's expression grew darker as she reviewed email screenshots, call logs, and my detailed documentation of Gerald's escalating pressure campaign. Rachel, this isn't just family dysfunction. This is systematic financial and psychological abuse with multiple family members as either victims or collaborators. Some of this behavior could have legal implications. What kind of legal implications? Financial surveillance without consent, psychological harassment, possibly even elder abuse if Gerald's using similar tactics to control his wife's access to money and decision-making. You've documented a pattern of behavior that goes way beyond normal family financial discussions. Carmen leaned back in her chair, studying my documentation with the focused attention of someone processing complex information. The question is what you want to accomplish. Do you want Gerald to back off and leave you alone? Do you want to expose his behavior to the family? Do you want to help other family members recognize what's happening to them? Or do you want to pursue legal consequences for what he's done? I want him to lose the power to control other people's lives. I want Patricia to get her painting supplies back. I want David to learn how to make financial decisions without asking Daddy for permission. I want Helen to have access to money without Gerald's oversight. And I want to make sure Gerald can never do this to anyone else. That's a comprehensive dismantling of a system that's taken him decades to build. Are you prepared for the backlash that's going to come when you challenge this directly? I thought about Patricia's wistful expression when she talked about painting. I thought about David's genuine fear that independent financial decisions would lead to ruin. I thought about Helen's reflexive deference to Gerald's judgment on matters that affected her own life. I thought about the version of myself who used to wake up excited about CrossFit classes before Gerald decided my gym membership was wasteful. I'm prepared for whatever comes next. I'm not prepared to spend the rest of my life pretending this is normal. Carmen nodded slowly, and I could see her shifting into strategic planning mode. Okay, if you want to dismantle Gerald's system, we need to expose it in a way that can't be dismissed as personal conflict or family drama. We need to show the pattern, the impact, and the systematic nature of what he's been doing. And we need to do it in a context where his usual manipulation tactics won't work. What do you have in mind? Carmen smiled, and for the first time in months, I felt like I had an ally who understood both the scope of the problem and the complexity of the solution. Gerald's built his reputation on being the wise patriarch who helps family members make sound financial decisions. What happens when that reputation gets publicly tested against the reality of his behavior? As Carmen outlined her idea, I realized that Gerald's greatest strength, his public image as a successful businessman and devoted family man, was about to become his greatest vulnerability. The reckoning wasn't just coming. It was going to be spectacular. The opportunity presented itself 3 weeks later in the form of an invitation that Gerald couldn't resist. The Phoenix Chamber of Commerce was hosting their annual Business Leaders and Family Values Gala, featuring a panel discussion on successful family financial planning. Gerald had been invited to speak as an expert on multi-generational wealth management, sharing his insights on helping family members make sound financial decisions while maintaining strong family bonds. Carmen's research into the event revealed that it would be attended by Phoenix's business elite, recorded for the Chamber's podcast series, and live-streamed to members across Arizona. Gerald would be speaking to hundreds of people in person and potentially thousands online about his approach to family financial guidance. The irony was perfect. Gerald would be publicly celebrating his methods of family financial control in front of an audience who would be horrified to learn what those methods actually looked like in practice. "This is our moment," Carmen said as we reviewed the event details. Gerald's going to spend an hour explaining how wonderful his approach to family financial planning is. What happens when the audience sees documented evidence of what that approach actually does to family members? The plan we developed was elegant in its simplicity. While Gerald was on stage discussing the benefits of collaborative family financial decision-making, I would be in the audience with a folder containing screenshots, email threads, bank statements, and recorded conversations that revealed the reality behind his public presentation. But we needed more than just documentation. We needed Gerald to incriminate himself publicly, to demonstrate his controlling behavior in real time, in front of witnesses who couldn't be manipulated or gaslit into accepting his version of events. The setup required careful orchestration. Carmen helped me prepare questions that would prompt Gerald to elaborate on his methods, reveal his attitudes toward family member autonomy, and demonstrate the psychological manipulation tactics he used to maintain control. Each question was designed to sound like genuine interest in his expertise, while actually inviting him to expose the darker aspects of his approach. The week before the gala, I told David I'd be attending to support his father's presentation. David was pleased that I was showing interest in Gerald's professional recognition, interpreting my attendance as a sign that I was finally coming around to appreciating his father's financial wisdom. "Dad's really excited about the speech," David told me over dinner. "He's been working on it for weeks. I think it could lead to some consulting opportunities with other families who want help with financial planning." The thought of Gerald expanding his systematic control to other families was exactly the motivation I needed to ensure our plan succeeded. Gerald's presentation was scheduled for the second half of the evening, after dinner and the awards ceremony. Carmen arrived separately and positioned herself near the back of the room with a clear view of both the stage and the audience reaction. I sat in the middle section, close enough to be recognized if Gerald spotted me, but not so prominent that I'd seem confrontational. The evening began with typical Chamber of Commerce networking and recognition ceremonies. Local business leaders were honored for community contributions, scholarship recipients were celebrated, and sponsors were acknowledged with polite applause. Gerald worked the room during cocktail hour, introducing himself to potential clients and accepting congratulations on his speaking opportunity. I watched him operate with the smooth confidence of someone accustomed to being the smartest person in the room. He discussed investment strategies with bank executives, offered financial planning advice to young entrepreneurs, and positioned himself as the wise mentor everyone wished they had access to. His public persona was compelling, successful, generous, and genuinely interested in helping others achieve financial security. It was a masterclass in how effective manipulation requires a foundation of genuine competence and apparent benevolence. When Gerald took the stage for his presentation, he commanded the room with natural authority. His speech began with heartwarming stories about helping his children navigate early career financial challenges, supporting his daughter-in-law's transition into the family, and creating systems that allowed multiple generations to build wealth together while maintaining strong personal relationships. Family financial planning isn't just about maximizing returns or minimizing taxes, Gerald told the attentive audience. It's about creating structures that honor both individual goals and collective family values. When family members feel heard, supported, and guided rather than controlled, they make better financial decisions and maintain stronger relationships. The audience nodded approvingly. Gerald's philosophy sounded enlightened, collaborative, and emotionally intelligent. Several people were taking notes, clearly impressed by his approach to balancing individual autonomy with family financial coordination. Quote, "The key," Gerald continued, "is establishing trust through transparency and consistent guidance. Family members need to know that their financial mentor has their best interests at heart, that advice comes from experience and wisdom rather than self-interest, and that individual concerns are always considered within the context of long-term family prosperity." This was the moment Carmen and I had been waiting for. Gerald had established his credentials as a family financial mentor who respected individual autonomy while providing wise guidance. The audience had accepted his framing of himself as a benevolent advisor rather than a controlling patriarch. During the question and answer session, I raised my hand. Gerald's face lit up when he recognized me, clearly pleased that his daughter-in-law was participating in his professional moment. Gerald, you mentioned the importance of family members feeling heard rather than controlled. How do you handle situations where a family member's financial choices conflict with your recommendations? It was a softball question that allowed Gerald to demonstrate his enlightened approach to managing family financial disagreements. But it was also an invitation for him to reveal his actual methods of resolving conflicts when persuasion wasn't sufficient. That's an excellent question, Rachel, Gerald said, using my name to signal our family relationship to the audience. I always start by trying to understand why someone is making a choice that seems financially suboptimal. Usually, there are emotional or psychological factors that need to be addressed before the person can see the situation clearly. But what if they continue to make choices you believe are harmful to their financial well-being? Gerald's smile tightened slightly, and I could see him calculating how much of his actual approach he could reveal without undermining his public image. Well, sometimes family members need more support to overcome barriers to good financial decision-making. That might involve bringing other family members into the conversation, seeking professional guidance to address underlying issues, or implementing systems that provide more structure and oversight until better habits are established. The audience was still nodding along, but I could see a few people beginning to look slightly uncomfortable with Gerald's language about overcoming barriers and implementing systems that provided oversight for adult family members. Carmen raised her hand from the back of the room. Gerald didn't recognize her, so he called on her with the confident expectation of another supportive question. Can you give us a specific example of how these systems work in practice? Like, what does oversight look like when you're helping an adult family member develop better financial habits? Gerald hesitated for the first time during his presentation. The question asked for concrete details about methods he preferred to keep abstract and theoretical. Well, it varies depending on the situation. Sometimes it means having access to account information so you can identify problematic spending patterns. Sometimes it involves collaborative budgeting, where major purchases are discussed and approved by family members who have more experience with financial planning. What happens if someone refuses to participate in collaborative budgeting or doesn't want to share account information? Gerald's discomfort was becoming visible now. His confident demeanor was shifting toward defensiveness as the questions pushed him to reveal the coercive aspects of his, quote, collaborative approach. Family financial planning requires commitment from everyone involved. If someone isn't willing to participate in the process, then they're choosing to prioritize individual preferences over family financial security. At that point, you have to decide whether you can continue providing support to someone who isn't committed to the collective approach. The room had grown noticeably quieter. Gerald's language about people who, quote, prioritize individual preferences, and his implicit threat to withdraw support from non-compliant family members, was revealing the controlling foundation beneath his collaborative rhetoric. I stood up, holding the folder Carmen and I had prepared. Gerald, I think it would be helpful for the audience to see what your collaborative approach looks like in practice. I began walking toward the stage, and Gerald's face went pale as he realized what was about to happen. Rachel, this isn't the appropriate venue for... I think it's exactly the appropriate venue. You're presenting yourself as an expert on family financial planning that respects individual autonomy. The audience should see evidence of how that works with actual family members. I reached the front of the room and turned to face the audience, holding up my folder of documentation. Gerald canceled my gym membership without my knowledge or consent because he decided it was wasteful spending. When I objected, he pathologized my resistance as anxiety and arranged for his wife to suggest I needed therapy. He monitors our bank account transactions and reviews our spending at family dinners. He created a family financial harmony plan that requires family approval for any individual purchases above his predetermined limits. The audience was completely silent now, and I could see people exchanging glances as they began to understand the disconnect between Gerald's public presentation and his actual methods. I have screenshots of emails where Gerald and my husband coordinate strategies for managing my financial irrationality and resistance to family guidance. I have recorded conversations where family members pressure me to accept Gerald's oversight because questioning his methods is portrayed as threatening family stability. Gerald tried to regain control of the situation. Rachel, you're clearly upset, and this is neither the time nor place for personal family discussions. Perhaps we should. I'm not upset, Gerald. I'm providing evidence. You told this audience that your approach helps family members feel heard rather than controlled. You said that individual concerns are always considered. You presented your methods as collaborative and voluntary. I opened the folder and held up screenshots of the email thread between Gerald and David titled Rachel's Situation Management. This is Gerald's collaborative approach in practice. Coordinated psychological manipulation designed to force compliance with his financial decisions. Systematic undermining of family members who assert independence. Strategic use of other family members as unwitting participants in campaigns to gaslight non-compliant relatives back into submission. The room erupted. People were pulling out phones to take pictures of the documents I was holding. Conversations broke out at tables as audience members processed what they were witnessing. Gerald's professional reputation was disintegrating in real time, as his public persona collided with documented evidence of his private behavior. Carmen stood up from the back of the room, holding her own copies of our evidence. Gerald Whitman has been systematically financially abusing his family members for decades, while presenting himself as a wise mentor. His daughter hasn't bought art supplies in 8 years because he convinced her that creative expenses are financially irresponsible. His son has never made an independent financial decision as an adult because Gerald has maintained complete control over his financial life. His wife requires permission for purchases above $20 because Gerald has convinced her that individual spending without oversight threatens family financial security. And when family members resist this control, Gerald pathologizes their resistance and recruits other family members to pressure them back into compliance. The moderator was trying to restore order, but the damage was irreversible. Gerald's carefully constructed public image as a benevolent family financial mentor had been exposed as a facade, hiding systematic control and psychological manipulation. But the most devastating moment came when Patricia stood up from a table near the front of the room. She had been invited to attend as Gerald's family support, expected to provide a warm testimonial about her father's wise guidance if needed. Instead, she looked directly at Gerald and said in a voice that carried clearly through the now quiet ballroom, "I want my painting supplies back." The simple statement was more powerful than any of our documentation. Patricia's quiet declaration of independence, delivered in front of hundreds of people who had just learned about Gerald's control tactics, crystallized the human cost of his systematic manipulation. Gerald tried one last desperate attempt to reframe the situation. This is clearly a coordinated attack on my reputation by family members who are struggling to accept guidance about financial responsibility. I'm disappointed that personal family conflicts are being aired in this inappropriate venue, but I remain committed to helping my family members make sound financial decisions. But his words fell flat. The audience had seen too much evidence, heard too much detail, and witnessed too much genuine emotion from his victims to accept his gaslighting explanation. Carmen had prepared for this moment. She stepped forward with the final piece of evidence that we had saved for maximum impact. Gerald, you mentioned that family members who resist financial guidance are prioritizing individual preferences over family security. I'd like the audience to know that the individual preferences you're referring to include gym memberships for physical health, art supplies for creative expression, retirement planning for financial independence, and the basic right to make personal purchases without family committee approval. You've characterized these normal adult activities as financially irresponsible behavior that threatens family stability. You've used psychological manipulation, social pressure, and systematic isolation to force compliance with your control. And you've done all of this while positioning yourself as a loving family mentor who respects individual autonomy. Carmen turned to address the audience directly. Gerald Whitman is not a family financial planning expert. He's a skilled manipulator who has spent decades perfecting techniques for controlling adult family members, while maintaining plausible deniability about his coercive methods. The standing ovation that followed wasn't for Gerald's presentation about collaborative family financial planning. It was for the courage it had taken to expose his systematic abuse in such a public forum. Gerald left the stage without another word, but not before I saw something in his expression that I had never seen before. For the first time in the 4 years I had known him, Gerald Whitman looked genuinely afraid. The recording of the evening would be circulated online within hours. Gerald's business reputation would be destroyed by morning. But more importantly, his power to control his family through manipulation and gaslighting had been broken by public exposure of his methods. Patricia approached me as people began filing out of the ballroom. "I'm buying art supplies tomorrow," she said quietly, "and I'm opening my own bank account. And I'm taking that trip to Sedona that Robert and I never got to take 8 years ago." Helen, who had witnessed the entire confrontation, looked shaken but not surprised. "I knew something wasn't right," she admitted. "I just didn't know what to call it or how to talk about it." David was nowhere to be seen. He had left during my presentation, unable to face the public exposure of his collaboration in his father's manipulation campaign. As Carmen and I walked out of the hotel that night, I felt something I hadn't experienced in 4 years of marriage: complete freedom from Gerald Whitman's control. He could no longer gaslight me into questioning my own judgment, manipulate family members into pressuring me, or present his controlling behavior as loving guidance. His power had been built on secrecy, isolation, and the ability to control the narrative about his methods. Once those foundations were removed through public exposure and documented evidence, his entire system of family control collapsed. The reckoning was complete, but the real work of rebuilding was just beginning. 6 months after the Chamber of Commerce gala, I woke up in my own apartment for the first time in 5 years. The morning light streaming through windows I had chosen, in a space I had rented with my own money, using security deposits I had saved independently. The silence wasn't the oppressive quiet of walking on eggshells around Gerald's expectations. It was the peaceful silence of authentic solitude. My coffee maker was a basic model from Target, not the high-end espresso machine Gerald had recommended as a sound investment in daily quality of life. My kitchen table was second-hand, purchased from a Phoenix estate sale rather than Gerald's preferred furniture stores that offered family discounts. Every item in the apartment had been chosen by me, paid for by me, and arranged according to my preferences rather than family-approved design principles. The transformation hadn't happened overnight. The weeks following Gerald's public exposure had been a masterclass in how quickly carefully constructed family dynamics could unravel when their foundation was removed. David's reaction to the gala confrontation had been exactly what I expected, and somehow still disappointing. Instead of recognizing the manipulation we'd been living under, he had framed my public revelation as a betrayal of family loyalty and a vindictive attack on his father's reputation. "You humiliated him in front of hundreds of people," David had said during our last conversation before I moved out. "Whatever problems you had with Dad's approach, there were private ways to address them. You chose to destroy his professional standing instead of working within the family to find solutions." The conversation crystallized everything wrong with Gerald's system of control. Even after witnessing documented evidence of systematic manipulation, even after seeing the psychological damage inflicted on Patricia and Helen, David still believed that preserving Gerald's authority was more important than addressing Gerald's abusive behavior. David, working within the family, meant accepting Gerald's authority to override my decisions and gaslight me into compliance when I resisted. There was no private resolution possible because the entire system was designed to prevent accountability. He was trying to help us build financial security. Maybe his methods weren't perfect, but his intentions were good. Good intentions don't excuse controlling behavior, and Gerald's intentions weren't good. They were self-serving. He maintained control by convincing you that dependence was security and independence was recklessness. David couldn't see the distinction because he had never experienced adult independence. Gerald's control felt like safety because it was the only system David had ever known. The thought of making major financial decisions without paternal oversight genuinely terrified him. I realized during that conversation that David and I had fundamentally different definitions of what marriage should look like. I wanted a partnership between equals, who made collaborative decisions while maintaining individual autonomy. David wanted a family structure where financial authority flowed from Gerald through him to me, with everyone's role clearly defined and consistently maintained. The divorce papers were filed 3 weeks later. David's response was swift and predictable. He hired Gerald's business attorney and attempted to claim financial assets that I had contributed to, but that Gerald had convinced him belonged to the family rather than to me individually. The legal battle that followed became another opportunity to expose Gerald's financial manipulation. My documentation of 4 years of systematic control provided clear evidence of economic abuse and financial coercion. The attorney Carmen had recommended specialized in cases involving financial domestic violence and was experienced in untangling deliberately obscured asset ownership. Gerald created a system where family members contributed money and resources to collective assets while maintaining individual legal responsibility for debts and obligations. My attorney explained during one of our strategy sessions. It's a sophisticated form of financial exploitation disguised as family cooperation. The discovery process revealed the full scope of Gerald's financial control over his adult children. Bank account access that had been granted for emergencies had been used for routine monitoring and control. Investment accounts managed, quote, for optimal returns had been structured to prevent individual access without Gerald's approval. Insurance policies purchased for family protection had been designed to benefit Gerald's estate planning rather than individual beneficiaries. Most damaging to Gerald's legal position were the emails David had saved documenting their coordination to undermine my financial independence. Courts take a dim view of systematic campaigns to gaslight someone out of legitimate assets. And Gerald's own words provided irrefutable evidence of intentional financial manipulation. The settlement awarded me not only my fair share of marital assets, but also compensation for the financial losses I had suffered through Gerald's interference with my independent financial planning. The gym membership Gerald had canceled was specifically mentioned in the court documents as an example of unauthorized interference with my personal autonomy and financial choices. But the real victory wasn't financial. It was psychological. The legal process had provided external validation that Gerald's behavior constituted abuse rather than guidance, that my resistance had been reasonable rather than irrational, and that the family's attempts to pathologize my independence had been manipulative rather than therapeutic. Dr. Morrison, the therapist Gerald had tried to recruit for his gaslighting campaign, actually provided a statement supporting my case. After reviewing the documentation I had compiled, she concluded that Gerald's referral had been an attempt to use therapeutic authority to reinforce his controlling narrative rather than a genuine concern for my mental health. Mr. Whitman presented Rachel's resistance to financial oversight as anxiety and paranoia that required professional intervention. Dr. Morrison's statement read, "However, the evidence suggests that Rachel's resistance was a healthy response to systematic financial abuse." Mr. Whitman's referral was an attempt to pathologize normal boundary-setting behavior and use therapeutic authority to reinforce his control. The statement was particularly devastating because Dr. Morrison was respected in Phoenix's professional community and had no personal interest in the family conflict. Her clinical assessment that Gerald's behavior constituted financial abuse rather than concerned guidance gave weight to accusations that might otherwise be dismissed as family drama. While my legal battles were unfolding, Patricia was fighting her own war for independence. The art supply she had purchased the day after the gala had sat unopened in her closet for weeks, while Robert pressured her to return them and apologize to Gerald for embarrassing him in public. "Dad's really hurt by what happened at the chamber event," Robert had told Patricia. "He's always tried to help us make smart financial decisions, and now people are questioning his motives. Maybe you could talk to Rachel about issuing some kind of clarification or apology." Patricia's response marked a turning point in her own liberation from Gerald's control. Dad hurt himself by trying to control other people's lives and calling it guidance. "I'm not apologizing for wanting to paint, and I'm not asking Rachel to apologize for exposing behavior that should never have happened in the first place." Patricia's defense of her own independence had ripple effects throughout the family system. Robert was forced to choose between supporting his wife's autonomy and maintaining his father's approval. Helen began questioning decades of deference to Gerald's financial oversight. Extended family members who had witnessed Gerald's professional humiliation started examining their own relationships with his helpful guidance. The art supplies eventually made their way out of Patricia's closet and onto an easel she set up in the spare bedroom that had previously been used for storing Gerald's financial documents and investment materials. Her first painting in 8 years was a watercolor landscape of the Sedona trip she and Robert finally took after Patricia opened her own bank account and booked the vacation without Gerald's input or approval. "It's not about the money," Patricia told me during one of our regular coffee meetings. "It's about remembering what it feels like to want something, and then just get it without having to justify why I deserve it, or prove that it's a responsible use of resources." Helen's liberation took longer, but was perhaps even more significant. At 72 years old, she had lived under Gerald's financial control for nearly 5 decades. Her awakening to the abusive nature of their relationship was gradual, but ultimately complete. The catalyst was discovering that Gerald had been monitoring her personal spending for years without her knowledge. Credit card statements, bank account activity, even cash withdrawals had been tracked and analyzed as part of what Gerald called household financial management. Helen had assumed that Gerald's occasional questions about her purchases were natural spousal interest in family expenses. The reality was that Gerald maintained detailed spreadsheets documenting Helen's spending patterns, complete with his analysis of which expenses were justified and which represented poor financial judgment. He had been using this information to gradually restrict Helen's access to money through subtle psychological manipulation disguised as protective financial guidance. "I thought I was forgetful when I couldn't find my credit cards," Helen confessed during a family dinner that notably excluded Gerald. "He would suggest that I was becoming absent-minded about financial matters, and that maybe I should let him handle the purchasing decisions for a while. I was grateful for his help." Helen's story revealed another layer of Gerald's systematic control. He had been deliberately creating situations that made Helen doubt her own competence, then positioning himself as the solution to problems he had manufactured. Hidden credit cards, confusion about account balances, and missing cash were all part of a campaign to convince Helen that she was becoming incapable of managing financial responsibilities independently. The psychological impact of discovering decades of manipulation was devastating for Helen, but it also provided the motivation she needed to reclaim her independence. At 72, she opened her first individual bank account, applied for her own credit card, and began making financial decisions without Gerald's oversight or approval. "I bought a purse yesterday," Helen announced proudly during one of our family gatherings, "not because I needed a purse, and not because it was on sale, and not because Gerald approved of the brand or the price. I bought it because I liked it and I wanted it, and it's my money to spend." Helen's purse became a symbol of resistance within the family. It was bright red leather with gold hardware, completely impractical for her lifestyle, and thoroughly delightful in its pure frivolity. Gerald's system had trained all of us to justify every purchase in terms of necessity, value, or long-term benefit. Helen's red purse was justified only by the fact that it made her happy. The broader community reaction to Gerald's exposure extended far beyond our family dynamics. The recorded video from the Chamber Gala had circulated widely on social media, shared by people who recognized similar patterns in their own families or professional relationships. Gerald's manipulation tactics were sophisticated enough to be educational, and his public humiliation was satisfying enough to be entertaining. Local news stations picked up the story when several other families came forward with complaints about Gerald's financial consulting services. The investigation revealed that Gerald had been using similar control tactics with non-family clients, positioning himself as an indispensable financial advisor while gradually increasing his authority over their financial decisions and personal autonomy. Gerald Whitman's methods represent a troubling trend in financial advising where controlling behavior is disguised as protective guidance, reported one local television story. Several former clients described systematic efforts to undermine their confidence in their own financial judgment, while increasing their dependence on Mr. Whitman's oversight and approval. The State Financial Regulatory Board opened an investigation into Gerald's business practices, focusing on whether his methods violated professional standards for financial advisors. While Gerald hadn't technically engaged in fraud or embezzlement, his psychological manipulation and systematic undermining of client autonomy raised serious ethical concerns about his fitness to provide financial guidance to vulnerable individuals. Gerald's business relationships unraveled as quickly as his family control. Professional colleagues who had respected his expertise began questioning his methods when they understood the psychological manipulation behind his apparent success. Investment partners distanced themselves from association with someone whose reputation had become toxic within Phoenix's business community. The man who had once been regarded as a wise patriarch and successful businessman became a cautionary tale about the dangers of unchecked authority and the importance of maintaining healthy boundaries in professional and family relationships. But Gerald's response to his public exposure revealed the true nature of his character more clearly than years of manipulation had. Rather than acknowledging the harm he had caused or attempting to make amends for decades of controlling behavior, Gerald doubled down on his narrative that he had been unfairly attacked by ungrateful family members who couldn't appreciate his guidance and sacrifice. He hired a crisis management consultant and attempted to rehabilitate his reputation through carefully crafted public statements that positioned him as the victim of a coordinated smear campaign. Gerald's statement to local media portrayed him as a dedicated family man whose generous financial guidance had been mischaracterized by family members seeking to avoid accountability for their own poor financial decisions. "I have spent decades helping my family members build financial security and avoid the mistakes that destroy so many American households," Gerald's statement read. "I am disappointed that my efforts to provide guidance and support have been misrepresented as controlling behavior by individuals who prefer independence over responsibility and immediate gratification over long-term planning." Gerald's public response was the final confirmation that his behavior had been intentional manipulation rather than misguided good intentions. A genuinely concerned family member who discovered that their helpful guidance was perceived as controlling would express remorse and seek to understand the impact of their behavior. Gerald's response was to blame his victims for misinterpreting his methods and accuse them of character flaws that justified his continued control. The crisis management campaign failed spectacularly. Gerald's attempt to portray himself as a victim of ungrateful family members was undermined by the extensive documentation of his manipulation tactics and the credible testimonies of multiple family members describing years of systematic control. Public opinion solidly supported the family members who had exposed his behavior rather than the man who refused to acknowledge the harm he had caused. Gerald's refusal to accept responsibility for his controlling behavior ultimately isolated him from the family relationships he had spent decades manipulating. David remained loyal to his father's narrative, but David's support came at the cost of relationships with Patricia, Helen, and eventually with extended family members who recognized Gerald's behavior as abusive rather than protective. The family holiday gatherings that had once centered around Gerald's authority and Helen's hosting became smaller, more authentic celebrations that prioritized genuine connection over performative family harmony. Patricia hosted Thanksgiving in her own home, serving food she had chosen and prepared without committee approval. Helen organized Christmas around activities she enjoyed, rather than traditions Gerald had established and maintained through decades of subtle control. I was invited to these new family celebrations, not as David's wife or Gerald's daughter-in-law, but as Rachel, the person who had found the courage to speak truth about systematic abuse and create space for other family members to reclaim their own independence. My own life rebuilt itself around choices that reflected my authentic preferences, rather than carefully calculated decisions designed to minimize conflict with Gerald's expectations. I rejoined CrossFit Desert Peak, where Marcus and the community welcomed me back with the understanding that my absence had been involuntary. I opened investment accounts that aligned with my personal financial goals rather than Gerald's portfolio optimization strategies. I bought a car that I liked driving, rather than one that Gerald had researched and recommended for optimal value retention. Each independent decision reinforced my confidence in my own judgment and reminded me of the person I had been before Gerald's systematic manipulation had trained me to second-guess my instincts and defer to his expertise. The most satisfying aspect of my rebuilt life was its complete independence from Gerald's approval or oversight. He had no access to my financial accounts, no input into my purchasing decisions, and no platform for critiquing my choices or offering unsolicited guidance. I was finally free to succeed or fail based on my own decisions, to learn from my own mistakes, and to build wealth according to my own priorities and timeline. Carmen, who had been instrumental in helping me expose Gerald's manipulation, became not just a friend but a business partner. We started a consulting service for people trying to escape financial abuse and control within family or romantic relationships. Our combined expertise in marketing strategy and psychological manipulation tactics proved invaluable in helping clients document abusive behavior, develop exit strategies, and rebuild their financial independence. The hardest part isn't usually the legal or financial aspects, Carmen observed during one of our client strategy sessions. It's helping people trust their own judgment after years of being trained to doubt their instincts and defer to someone else's authority. Our work with financial abuse survivors reinforced the lesson I had learned through my own experience with Gerald's control. Independence isn't just about having access to money, it's about having confidence in your own ability to make financial decisions without external validation or approval. The gym membership that had started this entire confrontation became a symbol of reclaimed autonomy in my rebuilt life. Every morning when I arrived at CrossFit Desert Peak, I remembered what it felt like to choose something purely because it made me happy and contributed to my health and well-being. Gerald's attempt to eliminate my gym membership because it didn't fit his optimization model had been the catalyst that exposed his entire system of control. Marcus often used my story as an example for other gym members who were struggling with unsupportive family members or partners who criticized their commitment to fitness. Health and independence are connected, Marcus would explain to clients dealing with family pressure about their gym memberships. When someone tries to undermine your commitment to physical wellness, they're usually trying to undermine your confidence in your own judgment about what's good for you. That's not about money or time management. That's about control. My story became part of the gym's culture, shared as encouragement for members who needed permission to prioritize their own health and happiness over family members, criticism, or financial pressure. 1 year after the Chamber of Commerce Gala, Gerald made a final attempt to reassert control over the family narrative. He organized what he called a family healing retreat, designed to address the conflicts that had divided the family and restore the collaborative relationships that had been damaged by misunderstandings and external interference. The invitation was addressed to all family members and framed as an opportunity to move beyond past conflicts and rebuild the strong family bonds that had always been Gerald's priority. The retreat would include professional family counselors, financial planning workshops, and structured activities designed to improve communication and restore trust within the family system. Gerald's invitation was a masterpiece of manipulation disguised as reconciliation. He positioned himself as the peacemaker seeking to heal relationships damaged by conflict, while subtly implying that family members who declined to participate were choosing continued discord over family harmony. "I miss the closeness we used to have," Gerald's invitation letter concluded. "I believe we can work through the misunderstandings that have created distance between us and rebuild the trust and cooperation that made our family financial planning so successful. I hope you'll join me in this effort to restore our family bonds." The invitation revealed that Gerald still fundamentally misunderstood the nature of the conflict. He characterized systematic financial abuse as misunderstandings and portrayed his victims, independence, as damage to family relationships that needed healing. Gerald's worldview remained unchanged. Family members who resisted his control were problems to be solved, rather than individuals with legitimate autonomy who deserved respect. Patricia's response to Gerald's invitation was swift and definitive. She declined to attend the family healing retreat, and instead organized her own family gathering for people who were interested in maintaining relationships without Gerald's oversight or mediation. "I don't need healing from wanting to paint," Patricia wrote in her response to Gerald's invitation. "I don't need counseling to learn how to accept financial control. And I don't need professional guidance to understand that independence is healthy rather than selfish. I'm happy to maintain a relationship with you if you can respect my autonomy, but I'm not interested in retreats designed to convince me that your control was actually caring." Helen's response was even more direct. She returned Gerald's invitation with a handwritten note that said simply, "I bought myself another purse. It's bright purple with silver studs. I love it." Helen's note was a perfect encapsulation of her liberation from Gerald's control. She had moved from justifying her purchases based on necessity and value to making buying decisions based purely on personal pleasure. The purple purse with silver studs served no practical purpose and provided no financial benefit. It existed purely because Helen wanted it and could afford it and refused to ask permission for small pleasures that made her happy. I declined Gerald's invitation without explanation. Gerald no longer had any authority over my time, attention, or emotional energy. I didn't owe him engagement with his attempts to re-establish control, and I didn't owe him explanations for my refusal to participate in his manipulation. David attended Gerald's family healing retreat, along with Robert and a few extended family members who remained convinced that Gerald's intentions had always been good and that the conflicts were the result of misunderstandings rather than systematic abuse. The retreat, according to Patricia's sources, focused heavily on forgiveness, family loyalty, and the importance of maintaining strong family financial coordination despite temporary conflicts. Gerald's presentation emphasized the dangers of financial independence and the benefits of collaborative family decision-making guided by experienced leadership. No family members who had exposed Gerald's controlling behavior attended the retreat. The people who participated were either still under Gerald's control or had never been directly targeted by his manipulation tactics. The retreat served primarily to reinforce Gerald's narrative among family members who were already aligned with his perspective, rather than actually healing relationships with people he had harmed. Gerald's family healing retreat was the last time he attempted to reassert control over the family narrative. When his reconciliation efforts failed to restore his authority, he gradually withdrew from family relationships, rather than accept the new dynamic where family members maintained independence from his oversight and guidance. 2 years after the Chamber of Commerce Gala, Gerald and Helen divorced. Helen's growing independence and confidence in her own financial judgment made their relationship unsustainable from Gerald's perspective. He couldn't accept a marriage where his wife made independent financial decisions, questioned his guidance, and refused to defer to his authority on household expenses. Helen's divorce settlement was substantial, reflecting decades of financial contributions to Gerald's business success and compensation for years of financial manipulation and control. She used part of the settlement to buy a small house near Patricia, where she set up an art studio and began taking painting classes alongside her daughter. "I never thought I'd be starting over at 75, Helen told me during one of our coffee meetings. But starting over feels better than spending the rest of my life asking permission to buy purses." Helen's transformation from financially controlled spouse to independent woman was inspiring for everyone who witnessed it. She proved that it's never too late to reclaim autonomy, that financial independence is possible at any age, and that liberation from controlling relationships is worth the disruption and uncertainty of rebuilding your life. David's response to his mother's divorce was to distance himself further from family members who had challenged Gerald's authority. He moved across the country to take a job with one of Gerald's former business associates, maintaining minimal contact with Patricia, Helen, or me. David never developed the capacity for independent financial decision-making, instead transferring his dependence from Gerald to other authority figures who provided the structured guidance he couldn't live without. Patricia and I often discussed David's inability to adapt to life without Gerald's control. We felt sadness for the person David might have become if he had been allowed to develop autonomy and confidence in his own judgment. But we also recognized that David's refusal to question Gerald's methods had made him a collaborator in systematic abuse rather than just another victim. 3 years after my gym membership catalyzed the exposure of Gerald's financial control, I was invited to speak at the same Chamber of Commerce Gala, where Gerald had once presented himself as an expert on family financial planning. My presentation was titled Recognizing Financial Abuse in Family Relationships, and focused on helping business leaders identify controlling behavior disguised as financial guidance. The audience included many people who had witnessed Gerald's public exposure 3 years earlier. My presentation received a standing ovation, not just for the content but for the courage it had taken to transform a personal trauma into educational advocacy that could help other families avoid similar abuse. Financial abuse often looks like helpfulness, I told the audience. Controllers position themselves as protectors, manipulators present themselves as mentors, and abusers frame their behavior as loving guidance. The difference between legitimate financial support and financial abuse is whether the support increases your independence or increases your dependence on the person providing guidance. After my presentation, several audience members approached me with their own stories of financial control within family or romantic relationships. Some were seeking advice for escaping controlling situations. Others wanted to understand whether their own helpful guidance to family members might be crossing boundaries into manipulation. The conversations reinforced the importance of the work Carmen and I were doing to help people recognize and escape financial abuse. Gerald's manipulation tactics weren't unique. They were part of a broader pattern of controlling behavior that many families experienced, but few people knew how to identify or address. Carmen joined me at the reception following my presentation, and we spent the evening connecting with potential clients, referral sources, and other professionals who worked with financial abuse survivors. The same ballroom where Gerald had been exposed as a manipulative controller had become a networking venue for people committed to helping others escape financial abuse and rebuild independent lives. The transformation felt symbolic of the broader changes that had occurred in our family and community. Spaces that had once reinforced controlling authority now hosted conversations about autonomy and independence. People who had once deferred to Gerald's expertise now questioned authoritative claims and demanded evidence rather than accepting guidance based on reputation alone. My rebuilt life centered around choices that reflected my authentic values, rather than carefully calculated decisions designed to minimize conflict or maximize approval from authority figures. I lived in a space I had chosen, furnished with items I had selected, decorated according to my preferences rather than family-approved design principles. My work provided income that I managed independently, invested according to my own goals and timeline, and spent on priorities that reflected my personal values rather than committee-approved financial optimization. My relationships were based on mutual respect and genuine compatibility rather than hierarchical family structures or prescribed role expectations. The gym membership that had started this entire journey remained a central part of my routine, but it had evolved from a symbol of resistance to simply one component of a life built around authentic choices. Every morning at CrossFit Desert Peak, I remembered what independence felt like and reinforced my commitment to maintaining autonomy over my own decisions. Marcus often reminded me that physical strength and psychological strength were connected, that the discipline required for fitness paralleled the courage required to maintain boundaries with controlling people. "You've built both kinds of strength," he observed during one of our training sessions. "The physical strength to handle whatever life throws at you, and the psychological strength to trust your own judgment, even when other people try to convince you that you're wrong." 5 years after Gerald canceled my gym membership to save family money, I canceled his power to control my life to save my own sanity and freedom. The trade was worth every moment of conflict, every difficult conversation, every relationship that couldn't survive my insistence on basic respect and autonomy. Gerald had taught me an inadvertent lesson about the nature of control and independence. Controllers maintain power by convincing their victims that dependence is safety, that questioning authority is dangerous, and that individual preferences are selfish. Independence is reclaimed by rejecting those narratives and making choices based on your own judgment rather than someone else's approval. The $59 gym membership Gerald had canceled without my permission became the catalyst for a transformation that freed not just me, but multiple family members from systematic financial and psychological abuse. Sometimes the smallest acts of resistance reveal the largest systems of control, and sometimes the most personal battles have the most far-reaching consequences. Patricia still paints. Helen still buys impractical purses. I still wake up at 5:30 for CrossFit classes. And Gerald no longer has any power to interfere with any of those choices. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.